Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed lunch, and it looks like there's a few new faces in the audience. We may have swapped some out, had some leave, and had some join us for this afternoon. So thank you for being here. We've got a large contingent online as well. So we're back to talk about the commercial platforms, the phased, and give everyone a phase 2 update. Without further ado, we have an esteemed panel with us here today of mostly GSA folks who can help explain what commercial platforms are and how we're planning to go about addressing the requirement that we got. And here to moderate this panel for us is our own Chris Averill. He's with the Office of Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs at GSA, and he will moderate the session for us.
Thank you, Crystal. Good afternoon, everyone. We're pleased that you're here. Thanks for sticking it out through the lunch break and coming back, and thanks to everybody who's new for joining. We are going to have a wonderful discussion this afternoon about the Commercial Platforms Initiative, and so we'll start with all of our panelists giving some brief updates from their perspectives, and then there will be time for Q&A, at which point I would ask everybody to kindly limit their questions to one, so we can get through as many as possible, and if there's additional time, we'll consider others. So for the afternoon, the team is here on stage to focus on providing a Phase 2 update on the initiative. That'll include a review of research findings to date, some insights on the road ahead. That includes some extensive discussion around the draft program documents that GSA and OMB recently released on FedBizOps for feedback on that proof of concept. So there's some links to that information that are on the Commercial Platforms Interact group. If you don't have the link to that, we will make sure to provide it by the end of the afternoon so that everybody can view the documents in their entirety and provide comments in the recommended time frame. And so without further ado, let me introduce the folks that are on the stage. To my immediate left is Matthew Blum. He is the Associate Administrator for OMB's Office of Federal Procurement Policy. To his left is Laura Stanton. She is GSA's Deputy Assistant Commissioner for the ITC Category Management. She's also the Executive Sponsor for the Commercial Platforms effort. Mark Lee is down the end. I'm a little out of order here, apologize. Assistant Commissioner for GSA's Federal Acquisition Service Office of Policy and Compliance. And finally, we have Jeff Kosis. He is GSA's Senior Procurement Executive in our Office of Government-Wide Policy. And so with that, I will turn it over to Matthew, who will be our first speaker.
Chris, thanks very much. As I said, I think this is now our third public meeting on the commercial online marketplaces, so I feel like we're almost like a family now. Maybe, and I guess we have to give names to to keep track of these events, and maybe this could be the home for the holidays, or maybe not. We'll see. But as everyone knows by now, the President's management agenda is intended to drive integrated, bold change in how the government delivers its mission. And earlier this morning, you heard a lot about GSA's vision for modernization of the federal marketplace. And as the Office of Federal Procurement Policy thinks about what modernization looks like across the government to build on GSA's ideas, we were giving careful consideration to the role of pilots and testing as a way to help accelerate incremental transformation to our acquisition processes. Last time, I think I started with a history lesson on open market buys. I won't do a long history lesson today, but suffice it to say that when OFPP was first created in 1974, Congress had the good sense to include as one of our core functions the encouragement of pilots and proofs of concept. And over the years, we have seen some significant pilots that have had a important and positive impact on our system. One easy one that comes to mind was the migration of the old Commerce Business Daily to Federal Business Opportunities. And I'm old enough to remember when we had the Commerce Business Daily, and I thought it was going to be intractable. We would never be able to move off of the paper copies of that and to Federal Business Opportunities. So that had a lot of goodness. That actually started with pilot authority that was given to us by Congress in the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act. But by and large, I think it's probably fair to say, and I think my colleagues would probably agree, that while we do have good examples of pilots and demonstrations, by and large, they have been relatively small in comparison to the opportunities that regularly present themselves. Pilots and proofs of concept have a number of important benefits that you know well. First, they help us build the evidence to support further investment, and they allow us to make course corrections based on the evidence that we have. And if done correctly, they allow us to disrupt the environment in a manageable way. So what do I mean by manageable disruption? And you know all of this too. 5 kind of points here. One is, talk to stakeholders to shape the proof of concept in the most thoughtful way possible, considering impact and feasibility. Second, start small. Test, evaluate, retest before you scale and institutionalize. Third, collect meaningful data to enable smart course corrections. 4, understand risk. Go in eyes wide open. In the case, and this has come up in our prior conversations, and I know a little bit this morning, making sure we understand the challenges faced when buying, from sources that haven't necessarily been fully pre-screened. And 5th, rationalize results. And here, if something works well for COTS, through this process, we need to figure out if it makes sense to apply in other spaces. We need to harmonize our activities to the nature of what we're buying, COTS, and not necessarily to the vehicle that's being used, a point that you all have made clear to us. Well, I'm guessing most of you have here had a chance to at least peek at some of the materials that GSA has shared in advance of this meeting. And you will obviously see that we are positioning ourselves to evaluate the opportunities posed by the commercial online marketplaces by starting with a proof of concept and following the principles that I just described, talking to stakeholders, starting small, collecting data, understanding risks. And let me put a pin for a minute in the first point of stakeholder engagement. In a moment, Laura, Jeff, and Mark are going to spend some time helping you to digest the vision for this proof of concept as presented in the materials that have been shared with you. And as you listen to them, I hope it isn't lost on you that your input that you have provided, whether it's in response to some of the RFIs or in one-on-one meetings, if you have been part of them, that they are helping to shape features of our internal implementation efforts. And I do think this is important because your time is valuable, and we want you to understand as we have these sessions and move forward how we're thinking about what you're telling us. And let me give you 3 relatively simple examples, but I think they set the framework for the discussion today. So example 1 is the scope of the proof of concept. As you know by the 4 corners of the law, this initiative is limited to the extent it focuses just on COTS and purchases below the SAT. And I think when the law was first enacted, it probably is fair to say that we were thinking, okay, the SAT's pretty manageable. It's a relatively small percentage of our total dollars. We'll work towards doing activities and transactions that go up to the SAT. Well, the feedback that you provided this past summer to the RFIs that GSA issued reinforced the potential complexity we face even in the SAT space in sorting out the roles and responsibilities between 4 parties, right? This is a true quadratic equation. GSA, the platform providers, sellers, the ordering agency. And for the many compliance requirements that apply even below the SAT, this seems somewhat daunting until you think through it and work through it. So this has played a big role in focusing our initial plans for the pilot on activity under the micro-purchase threshold. Example 2, rules of the road. At the last town hall, I discussed our vision of how online marketplaces might be thought of as an opportunity to modernize the 3 phone calls rule of the 1980s and 1990s, where buyers could go to their Rolodexes, identify 3 vendors, make calls, and basically select a winner. And for those of you that have been around for a while, you will remember that that was probably the most significant source of flexibility, I see some nodding heads, that existed in the 1980s and early 90s. And when we were negotiating this Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act with Congress, many of our senior procurement executives were like, please, let's raise thresholds and focus on that relief. What was interesting, by the way, as an aside, after I did that little review of history, some folks came up from the last event, and there were some millennials that were like, oh, we really loved this history lesson. Thank you so much. What's a Rolodex? Translation, you were so old. But then also some of my folks that are my contemporaries, said not so fast weren't as quite as enamored with my storytelling, and said that let's not talk so quickly through this, and remember there's an important difference between what we're talking about today and the 3 phone calls, and that being that authority which is in the FAR, was provided to warranted contracting officers that had a fair amount of training in our system and rules. So as you move forward, we need to make sure that if we're going to place more attention on the use of marketplaces and cards and those current card holders, we need to remember that the rules that exist in the FAR for micro purchases may need a little bit of tweaking to reflect the good thinking that our warranted contracting officers were doing with 3 phone calls. And you will see in the handout materials that we have developed, or I should say GSA has developed a set of ordering procedures that we were putting out for your comment and thought well in advance of when this will take effect, so that you can work and offer your thoughts back to us as we try to strike that right balance between efficiency and smart buying. Example 3, rationalizing our tools. So many are asking if we're thinking about the relationship of this program as it relates to category management, as well as the schedules and other existing vehicles that people use today for buying making their small dollar purchases. You're going to be hearing a lot of discussion on the role of data, which is probably the single most important value add that GSA can offer initially in this program. Why do I say that? Well, it's going to help our buyers and it's going to help our managers make rational decisions as to which tool makes the best sense in any given situation, which they can't easily do today. And by doing that, it will preserve the toolbox approach that we have always, and I think need to continue to embrace, to give our buyers as many options as possible while minimizing unintended consequences. These 3 features start with micro purchase, have online ordering procedures ready to go at the outset, and emphasizing our data analysis were all honed based on the many conversations that we've had with you. And I, again, applaud GSA for this prudent market research. At the same time, and my last point is I also applaud them for starting to nail down a timeline for launching this proof of concept, which Laura and team are going to talk about this as well today. So why am I emphasizing this latter point about, we need to move forward? Well, many of you have asked us what we're doing about agencies that are starting to experiment with marketplace providers on their own. And to be honest, some of these questions have come to us kind of in a whisper, and some of them have come, with you using your outside voices and blogs and in other kind of very public statements, which is very fair. This is a legitimate question to ask. And as GSA and OFPP, one thing we share in common is we are responsible by statute for thinking through whole of government issues. But the truth of the matter is, it isn't bad behavior on the part of our agency colleagues who want to continually look for new and better ways to serve their customers, right? This is the most basic definition of innovation and the strongest antidote to insanity, where we do the same thing every day and expect better results. And as I said at the outset, we need to do more piloting and experimenting. So in some levels, we're in a kind of a weird situation if we don't move forward, because we can't, again, criticize our agency colleagues for wanting to take advantage of these technologies and figure out how they can buy faster and smarter. That said, we don't want balkanization where a whole of government sandbox can be stood up to do this testing. So while we must continue to exercise prudence, and I'm confident that my colleagues and I know our office are going to do that, the sooner that GSA can stand up a smart proof of concept and get that off the ground, I think the better off we are ultimately going to be in rationalizing our testing, our understanding, and our ultimate scoping of this opportunity for the longer term. So with that, I'm now going to turn to Laura, Jeff, and Mark, who are going to do somewhat of a deeper dive on some of the details of this proof of concept.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. We did get a little bit of an upgrade from the GSA auditorium in order to accommodate all of you. But today is important for a number of reasons, not only because we've had a chance to dig deep into the federal marketplace based on what the GSA administrator had an opportunity to address this morning, the schedules modernization, and now going into another aspect of the federal marketplace, the commercial platforms initiative. And I appreciate Matthew really highlighting three key elements of this. First of all, the proof of concept and the importance of pilots. The second is the whole of government, and the third is the data, because all three of those have been recurring themes that we've been hearing that he quickly identified and pulled out in the way that Matthew does. I also do feel like a little bit like that it's become sort of a sibling group with the four of us spending this much time together over the past year, and all of you seeing us together too. But today is also the one-year anniversary since the FY18 National Defense Authorization Act was signed that brought Section 846 into law. And during that 1 year, we've spent a considerable amount of time listening to you to learn more and to take the lessons that Matthew identified and that I'll go deeper into to make the decision, to put forward the ideas. I won't even call them decisions yet, because we want to hear your feedback on them before they become decisions. But to begin to identify the path forward, that was built off of the listening session that we held back in January, where, if you remember, the only thing that we said was to actually ask a whole series of questions. In June of 2018, we sat down again and went through another listening session where we began to also share some of the initial market research and some of the report information that we had completed back in March. And then finally, today we're finally ready to share with you and highlight some of the key thoughts and the path forward that will move us into the proof of concept for the whole of government, the way that Matthew described. And during this time, what you'll hear from us is, I think a number of you, I hope, will recognize the feedback that you gave us and understand how we took that, we learned from it, and that we began to use that to shape our progress forward. But before I get into sort of what that is, let's just take a step back and talk a little bit about Section 846, and for those of you who may not be as familiar, some of you have been along the path every step of the way with us, and others might just be coming into this today. First of all, GSA is charged with establishing multiple contracts for electronic commerce portal providers. We have to consider portals that are widely used in the private sector and that provide features such as supplier and product reviews, invoicing payments, and customer service. The program would be implemented in phases over several years, allowing the government to consider such issues as data security, supply chain risks, and cybersecurity threats. That was originally called out, that we wanted to do a phased implementation to allow us time to identify and work through some of these issues. And then finally, GSA is asked to accept portal provider terms and conditions where possible, but should be judicious in asking for exemptions from existing rules and regulations. Put that into plain English, We are asked to accept all commercial terms and conditions at the same time that we make no changes to the existing procurement laws and regulations. For those of you who are familiar with both worlds, you're aware of what challenge that presents to us. And we have worked very hard to sort of thread that needle in the most useful way possible. Then a few months ago, the FY19 NDAA was signed, and the commercial platforms e-commerce surfaced once again with some important clarifications based on the conversations that we've been having. GSA now has the authority to develop the competitive procedures, and this is both, and Jeff will address competition at a deeper level, but this addresses both at the marketplace competition level and at the ordering level. And the role of competition as critical to the success of this program. The language in the FY19 NDA reiterated the need for multiple contracts with multiple portals. This was a point that we heard from all of you starting last January, as well as that we should be looking at this as a proof of concept, and that we need to have the buyers comparison shop as they make their purchases. Data usage protections were strengthened, stating that portal providers cannot use spend data for pricing, marketing, or competitive purposes. This has been one area where we've heard quite a bit of feedback, and we're taking that into account as we go forward. We know that we still need further feedback from you in this particular area, and you'll see that that is called out in the RFI as well. And in FY19 and for 2019. The micro-purchase threshold increased to $10,000 for Department of Defense. So, having stated these items, based on the legislation, we also have a series of program objectives that we're working to accomplish. The first is modernizing commercial product buying experience. The second is simplifying and streamlining COTS item purchases to allow agencies time to focus on their mission-oriented acquisition. And then finally, analyzing the COTS item purchasing spend data to allow for better buying decisions. We recently held a customer workshop, and we were talking about the value proposition. During that workshop, we asked what the value was and one of the agency representatives literally leapt out of her chair going, "Data, I want the data." And she was one of many voices in the room emphasizing the need and the desire to be able to get to that level of transactional data. We conducted a significant amount of research in phase one, and we heard a number of key themes around maximizing the flexibility and maintaining a balance of regulation and good public policy. We're still trying to work through exactly the tensions with both of those. But our phase one recommendations focused on modernizing competition requirements, given the existing, which we did get as part of the FY19 NDAA. We're currently in phase two of this effort, which calls for intensive market research. That research was used to guide the recently released request for information and will help us shape the contents of the March 2019 report. So we appreciate everything that you've done to date and ask you to continue to help us out with more and offer feedback. In the last year alone, we've conducted the 3 industry days that I've referenced already. We've released multiple RFIs. We also have met with 75 companies for one-on-one demonstrations and discussions about what this program could potentially do. And we've participated in numerous industry events to speak about this initiative. So we've conducted extensive stakeholder research on the industry side, and we've worked across the government to understand what the critical things are for them as well. We still have more. I want to emphasize, though, that we are going to continue to have opportunities for your involvement and for your feedback. As we begin to talk about the RFI that was released, that's beginning to shape and form the proof of concept that we're targeting for the end of 2019, and that's all built on what we've learned to date. So as we think about the proof of concept, we have a couple of goals. The first is, let's get something out there that the buyers can start using so we can figure this out. Going back to Matthew's point, we spent a lot of time learning. Let's now do something. Let's test this effort and acquisition reform at large in a controlled environment before going all in. And then finally, to begin to understand the potential impacts on other programs as we begin to use real spend and begin to see that. So the proof of concept is really is critical, and it's also something that if we don't, we need to continue to progress so that we have alternative and we have Section 846 in place for the whole of government to be able to use. As part of the RFI, we talked about the key objectives, the same one I referenced earlier, the modernizing the commercial buying experience, simplifying and streamlining COTS item purchasing, and analyzing the spend. So we also have, what we've done with this RFI is we've actually put something on paper for you. As I said, we've been listening, and after a year of listening, we've decided that it's time that we owe you something. So let me walk through the program outline, the go, no-go requirements, and then ultimately the capabilities that we're looking for. GSA intends to award multiple commercial e-commerce portals in support of the Commercial E-Platforms Initiative. Starting from the beginning, you have told us that we need to have multiple marketplaces. I remember it very distinctly back in the January, we heard it loud and clear during the January session. We plan for the proof of concept to permit spending up to the limits of the micro-purchase threshold, which is today capped at $10,000 per order. Orders will not be accepted above that, and keeping purchases below the micro-purchase threshold really keeps us very closely aligned to the commercial buying practices. This gets back to what I mentioned earlier on being able to sort of thread the needle on commercial versus retaining the rules and regulations. The proof of concept will test an e-marketplace model. The e-marketplace model is defined as an online marketplace that connects buyers with e-marketplace providers, proprietary products, and third-party vendors' products, or in some case only the latter. E-marketplace providers and third-party vendors are responsible for fulfilling orders for their respective products, with some exceptions where the e-marketplace providers may complete order fulfillment for an extra fee. GSA's intent is to start with a lightweight model that is different than what's commonly used today in the government e-commerce portals. The other thing we learned is that e-marketplaces are relatively new in the business-to-business space. We may be familiar and use them extensively in our personal lives, but many of the B2B capabilities that we're asking for and that we're looking for that are relatively new and often just under development. And so we want to be able to grow with the providers as they mature their offerings as they go forward. On the go, no-go requirements that we're looking for, and these are based on the stakeholder research, we're really going to be looking at what would not reflect commercial practice. And the proof of concept is really intended to address a smaller segment of the federal market to allow us to test these acquisition reform concepts on a smaller scale. And then finally, on the capabilities that we're looking for. We're looking for the in-depth product content and product reviews to aid the market research. We're looking for dynamic pricing and price comparisons to ensure competitive pricing available to the federal buyers. We're looking for information on order status and delivery tracking as part of the post-purchase process, and a robust workflow process between the purchasers and the approvers. With all of these attributes combined, we feel that the buyer will really experience a more robust and a modernized COTS buying experience than we have today. We want to be able to offer up the maximum amount of research for the buyers to have access to, and to be able to acknowledge and identify the cost savings across the commercial items. And we want to be able to leverage commercial practices by offering that the workflow processes and detailed visibility into the order status. There's more information on all of these items that I discussed, but this gives you a flavor as to our initial thoughts and where we want to take this. So I'm going to, that's very much the fact-based outline, and I'm going to be passing it over to Jeff to talk about really how GSA is using this to balance the policy objectives. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Laura. Matthew really gave you a terrific overview sense of three of the key items to be thinking about and set the context beautifully. Laura then married up those of you who've been following this initiative through every twist and turn for the last year to those of you who are new to the initiative, gave you the overall sense of where this is going, when it's going, and some of the key things. I wanted to take you now into some of the policy reasons, some of GSA's thought process as we've been laying out our initial set of thoughts. And I'm specifically saying initial set of thoughts, not decisions, because we see this as a continuation of a dialogue which has been underway for the last year. So as we're going through these thoughts, we have not locked down, and yes, this is the exact answer, but I think it will be helpful if we go through how we're thinking, approaching these issues, and why we've put out the concepts the way that we have. To organize this part of our conversation, I think it's helpful if, for the next few moments, we think in terms of 5 major buckets to kind of walk through, talk through, and understand the policy issues that are at play. These 5 that I'm going to talk about are, first, competition, what that means, where we're going with it. Second, customer satisfaction and the importance of that in this whole effort in maintaining the unity of government that Matthew spoke of. I want to talk about creating the right incentives for all the different parties who are part of this. I want to talk about understanding and managing risk, and then I want to talk about a broad category that I'm calling savings in public policy. This is an area where I expect many of you are going to have a lot of questions and that we can spend some time talking through. So as you've already heard, we're looking at operating at the micro-purchase level. So let me then turn to competition first as the first of these buckets to start walking, talking, and thinking through. From the earliest moments that GSA learned of Congress's interest in this initiative, we started stressing the importance of a competitive procedure. That was our very first set of comments on the first draft is, no, it's a mistake to go off with an idea of awarding one, that there needs to be an award to several. And we outlined several reasons, not the least of which is the long-term risk to us in being dependent on a single provider. Also, concerns about the stability of the marketplace, small business opportunity. We outlined a number of concerns on competition. We stayed pretty consistent on that message through every twist and turn, through all of the subsequent versions of the bill until we actually saw the version that was enacted into law and even the most recent set of changes. But when we're talking competition at multiple levels, and I think it's really important to understand that each of these levels. One, we're talking competition at the contract level. In the June meeting, I spent a few minutes talking about that, and at that time, I told those of you who were then following along that we need to make more than one award. That if we receive only one technically acceptable offer in, that we are going to cancel the solicitation, we're going to take several steps back, we're going to return to our market research, figure out why we didn't get better competition, and then figure out a path forward. I want to reaffirm that today. We are not looking for a proof of concept with one provider. There needs to be multiple e-marketplaces for this to be successful, for this to accomplish its purpose. Second, though, we're talking competition at the order level, and this is a significant and fundamental shift when we think about what a micro-purchase is, how it operates, what it means. We have never had a standard of requiring competition at the micro-purchase level. We're now putting that out. That is a significant and really impactful change. That's a direction that would take federal government purchasing into new space, new procedures, and the importance of that really needs to be heavily underlined. We're also, though, talking competition from the supplier perspective. One more reason we thought it's important to have multiple e-marketplaces is so that suppliers themselves have choice, are not forced into just one relationship. We heard that message from a number of the product vendors that we met with over the last year. We had heard different concerns about different business practices among the marketplaces. We heard different degrees of comfort, different thoughts about which one best would work for different commodity groupings, different areas of spend. And we saw it as absolutely essential that the suppliers, that the sellers, whatever term we want to use, have a choice of one or several portals, whatever best fits that business model. That brings me to the second major bucket, as we've been thinking this through, that's the issue of customer satisfaction. I think Laura mentioned that we had about 75 one-on-one meetings. A lot of those were demos of existing capabilities. We saw and heard from portal operators, from e-marketplaces, and from the e-procurement solution providers. One thing that really stood out for us, something we found tremendously impressive, was the emerging capability in the B2B functionality. We saw a number of things that we thought were especially valuable and impactful. I'd put some of the workflow tools at the very top of that list. I'd also include product comparisons, ability to have a preferred vendor listing, ability to load your existing contracts within those, the capacities for discounted pricing, a lot of really intriguing tools. That combination of elements really led us to say, when we talk about the proof of concept, where is the best place to start? That's part of what took us to the thought that it's likely the e-marketplaces that make the most sense as the first iteration to move forward in this. That said, we also were really interested in some of the functionality we saw through the e-procurement systems. Our sense is that comes at a future stage of the procurement, of the program. It probably doesn't fit when we're talking micro-purchase. It certainly doesn't fit when we're talking a lean start and moving forward, but it clearly seems to be part of this program. There's a really compelling, intriguing vision, one that we want to learn more about as we move deeper into it, as we move to successive proofs of concepts, and as the effort matures. As we're talking about some of these issues in and around customer satisfaction, we recognize ease of use, compliance, good pricing, they're all going to be key. Part of why they're going to be key is we're asking a lot of different players in this space. And it's important, let's recognize, what are we asking from the different participants? Let's start with our purchase card holders. We're asking them to operate very differently than they have up till now. We're asking them to consistently look at more than one source. We're asking them to recognize some new brief documentation requirements. We're asking that they be prepared and likely face additional questions. And as we're trying to build this environment, we are specifically asking them to move their open market spend, their true micro-purchase spend, to a GSA managed program. I want to emphasize that we're talking a very sizable spend that does not go through any contract vehicle today. We're not talking we're not talking buys under $10,000 made up of schedules. We're talking true micro purchases, vehicles today that don't have a contract, and we see just tremendous value in targeting and focusing on that segment of spend and moving it. That's our purchase card holders, though. Second, our agencies. What are we asking of federal agencies as part of that? Well, this is about starting to bring management to their micro purchase buys. It's about the need to get the visibility, to see what and how that spend is happening, and potentially to start shifting that spend. Not just shift it to the GSA solution, but perhaps shifting that to some of the mandatory sources. Today, for instance, we have no visibility on the AbilityOne spend in this space. We have no visibility on the federal prison industry spend. Candidly, we just don't have the insights into what happens in micro-purchase spend today. Laura told you there's a huge thirst for data among the agencies. There's a big desire on our part to share that data with the agencies, to have them use that to start changing behavior. That imposes yet another burden, another requirement on the federal agencies. We're now talking an extensive effort at retraining hundreds of thousands of P-card holders over time. Certainly not at this stage of the program. At this stage, we're talking a proof of concept. Long-term, though, this is all about agencies retraining card holders. Third audience, what are we asking of our suppliers? Certainly better pricing. When do we not ask for better pricing, right? Of course, we want better pricing. More than that, we're looking for you to be able to compare marketplaces, to identify which is the right channel for you to sell. And sometimes this is saying, let's establish a new channel. Let's come into a managed program in doing business across the government. Marketplaces, we're certainly asking for a lot of workflow functionality. We'll go through several of these, I suspect, both in the Savings Public Policy comments and in your questions. But EPLS checks, for example, we'd love to have some assurance that we're not buying from excluded parties and to have the proof of that. We're looking for the marketplaces to be able to display things such as environmental attributes, a whole host of data elements that in different ways federal agencies can provide, but we don't have today centralized and visible across micro-purchase spend. And marketplaces, we're asking for extensive data collection and reporting type requirements. So if we're going to be asking so much more of the buyer, of the agency, of the supplier, of the marketplace, we need a better overall experience. We need to have the savings, we need to have the value. That brings me to my third major bucket as we're thinking this through. That's how do we create the right incentives? So let's run through those same four players in this. The purchase card holders, well, for them, the buying experience, it has to be fast. It has to be easy. They have to have confidence that they're getting good pricing, confidence they'll be in compliance with the rules, frankly, confidence they're not going to be criticized for using this. One of the GSA initiatives that we're working, I'm calling taking the fear out of buying. It's part of our initiative, part of our focus across the agency this year. As we're talking to our purchase card holders, one of the values that agencies have communicated is their folks are so uncomfortable making a buying decision. There is a lot of value for us if we can free that fear up from our purchase card holders, make them feel confident that they're not going to be attacked for making a decision. For federal agencies, what's the incentives? It's freeing up contracting officers to do more complex buys, to focus on high dollar levels. As Matthew told you, that's hardly a new idea. I suspect we can probably trace that back decades as we're trying to say, where do we want our contracting officers to spend their time? And I'd suggest it's probably not buying COTS products when there are established prices. It probably is in a whole host of contract administration and oversight activities. It's about giving the agencies the data to direct the spend into more appropriate channels. We heard really great interest in specialty markets, everything from a first responder market to various types of technical equipment. And we heard lots of interest about supply chain and different supply chain concerns, some that we'll return to. For the suppliers, this is all about offering new access to federal opportunities. It's about addressing the concerns that they have with what data is out there. How's it going to be used? It's about giving them a choice. For the e-marketplaces, well, clearly, we need the ability to drive traffic and make this a worthwhile investment. Laura talked a little bit about the direction that we had from Congress, which basically stick as close to the commercial practice as you can. Well, we understand that, and we think there's great room for us to leverage what the marketplaces already have developed and are developing. We're not talking any fundamental change to the business model. We see a whole lot in the workflow tools, in the account structure, in what is made visible to different buyers that we think comports beautifully to the program attributes as we are currently envisioning them. So 4 different audiences, each of whom needs something very specific. We have to give all of them the right incentives. At the same time, I've already mentioned agency concerns with supply chain. That takes me into number 4. We have to understand the risk. One of the pieces in the legislation told GSA give a lot of thought to IT and healthcare items. Think about whether or not they should be bought through this type of portal. And we've heard a lot of different views on that. At this point, the program documents you see does not limit product categories. So why did we get there? How did we get there? Well, as I said, we went back, we looked carefully at the legislation, at what it said, And it very much said, GSA, think about this. It didn't say include it, it didn't say exclude it. It said, GSA, study this, assess it, come to a reasoned conclusion. We then met with a number of the industry associations, both in the IT space and in the healthcare space. And we specifically explored and tried to understand their supply chain concerns. What we walked away with, our understanding is there's always going to be a level of risk, and that level of risk goes up as the size of the order goes up, as the type of equipment you're talking about goes up, as we start dealing with services, as other pieces start getting added to that supply chain. So we're starting at the micro purchase. We think that starts us at a pretty low risk environment. We also talked to a number of agencies, and in talking to the agencies, they each seem to have very different ideas on what is and what is not an acceptable risk, and where should products be limited or not limited. Our understanding, having seen a host of demos, is through account setup tools, through user profiles, the marketplaces can manage that, can let agencies establish the limits that work based on their mission, their view, their understanding in a fast emerging area. We heard this morning some comments about how supply chain is likely to be a major focus of the next several years. We think it's early to be making decisions. We don't think this is the moment when we should be establishing a buy and don't buy list across government. But we do think it is the right time to start giving agencies the tools to make some decisions. Point 5, or bucket 5, savings and public policy. In this area, we've heard a whole big collection of issues from will there actually be savings, trade issues, Ability One issues, excluded parties, a whole litany of issues well worth talking about. So let's start with maybe one of the more fundamental questions. Will there be savings? Well, what do the advocates say? The advocates tell us that there's going to be big cost reductions and reduced administrative cost for agencies in completing their buys. They tell us that there will be reduced compliance costs on industry. They tell us that there's going to be easier access to competition, that there will be more firms coming in looking to sell to us. They'll tell us that there's the ability to negotiate B2B pricing, or better. They'll tell us that we can use the data to better manage our buying behavior, and that will result in savings. What do the critics say? Well, the critics say that the schedules already have really good pricing. And let me just stop and enjoy that point, if you don't mind, for just a moment. I can't tell you how many Hill briefings, how many FAR Council briefings, how many agency conversations, how many seminars I've stood up and defended and talked about why these schedules have good pricing. So yeah, I'm enjoying our new fans of schedule pricing. That's awesome. Again, we're not actually targeting the buys going through schedule. We think there is a vast and substantial market of open market, true open market micro purchases that's out there. Critics also point to things such as the recent Navy postgraduate study, other current examples, some of the work that the coalition has done and released just this week. They point to the fees that are charged by the marketplaces and say, you know, all these things, they're going to push your prices up. There aren't savings, they're going to be eaten up in marketplace fees. So who's right? You know, let me suggest the only fair answer is today, we don't know. We have two theories of the case. We have some pretty interesting arguments on both sides. We have no responsible data. We don't know, are there or are there not savings? What do we know? We know Congress gave us the authority to run with the program. We know Congress's sense is that there is the potential for significant savings, for streamlining, for time savings. So as we think this through, that's part of how we came up with the idea. When we launched the proof of concept, we should launch it at the micro purchase threshold. Could we have launched it at a higher dollar threshold? Absolutely. We had the legal authority to go up to the simplified acquisition threshold, up to $250,000. Matthew, I think you mentioned the word prudent in the decisions a few minutes ago. So where did we think it was prudent to start an experiment, to run with a proof of concept, to say, you know, there may be great savings, or we may be paying more. This may work and generate all kinds of time savings efficiencies. It may not. We thought, okay, let's strike that right balance. Let's run, we have a culture, we have an opening, we have a time when we can experiment, when we can try new things in the procurement environment. We don't always have that opening. There are times it's very hard to innovate and try new things. We've got the opening, we want to explore it, and we think the right place to do that is at the micro-purchase threshold. It lets us test the theory of the case, it lets us gather data, it lets us analyze the data, it lets us prove which of the two savings sides are right, the advocates or the doubters. If we see the benefits emerging, if we see cost savings, if we see other improvements, then we can expand and grow the program and move to higher dollar values, more proofs of concept. If not, we know that we've pursued a benefit that didn't work out. We figure out why not. Do we retrench the program? Do we revise it? They say, no, this wasn't a way to generate savings. Thus, data is really key to where we go. But there's lots of other aspects of public policy besides the savings piece. Supplier identification, we think, is a critical component. Let me return to Ability One. I've mentioned it a couple of times. We're looking for assurance that Ability One items actually are included and are being purchased. Today, we don't have that assurance at the micro-purchase threshold. We don't have the data. We don't have the visibility. Our understanding is by providing a feed of ETS items, that can be made visible to the buyers in lots of different ways, and the buyers can then make the right decisions. Small business. We're looking for ways to promote small business through the program, and our thought is that small businesses who choose to will be able to register as such through SAM, and that information can then port over to the marketplaces to be visible, any socioeconomic information for the buyer to make a decision. It may not happen day one, it may not happen year one, but that's a really intriguing and new opportunity for the small business space. We'd like to have some real assurance that we're actually preventing purchasing from excluded parties, and believe that by providing a feed from SAM, the excluded party listing, the marketplaces can implement some of the appropriate controls, so we have that assurance. We also think there's great value in displaying environmental attributes, and again, believe there's a data source from agencies on a host of those where we can put the information in front of the buyers. Trade issues, certainly an area that we've thought a lot about and considered. We talked through and considered, should we establish a more restrictive policy? But we concluded at this point it makes more sense to align with micro-purchasing procedures. Do we want to make it hard for people to use a government-wide program and instead create 50,000 different variations with every agency setting up its own program? No, probably that doesn't make a lot of sense. Bigger picture, we see this as a huge deregulatory opening. We've been able to have some very good conversations on Congress on the importance, on the value of deregulatory actions. This year's National Defense Authorization Act, you saw GSA draft and Congress adopt a regulatory rollback provision, letting the FAR Council go back and look at the last couple of decades of new regulations and say, hey, do this really need to apply to commercial items? Give that another thought, and if so, explain why it does. So if we're actively pushing for a regulatory rollback, if we have the opportunity, if we have the opening, why would our first action be to apply a regulatory environment not required by law, not required by statute? We have to commit to our own belief, our own view on what is the right program direction. When we talk about the contracts, we see the contracts with the e-marketplaces being commercial item contracts, service contracts, and as such, we put out some draft terms and conditions. They're a pretty limited list. The terms and conditions are either one, required by law to apply to commercial contracts, two, required by executive order, and I think we actually may have more required by executive order than we do by law at this point, or we think that they're consistent with the customary commercial practice. We think that based on your responses to the earlier RFIs, based on the one-on-one conversations. But again, we're still in a testing phase. We're asking you. So if we've drawn those incorrectly, if we've missed key points, if they are not consistent, or if you read the law and EOs differently, let us know that. This is the opening to make these changes still. So getting to this limited list, it's a pretty substantial deviation to the far and to the GSAR, but that is indeed our thought process at this point. For suppliers, the terms and conditions, again, are minimal, just those required by law or executive order, and they're really minimized by treating these as individual micro purchases, not as big umbrella contract with the suppliers. So hopefully that gives you some insight into how we've been thinking, talking, exploring these issues. Let me now turn it over to Mark Lee, FASA Assistant Commissioner for Policy and Compliance.
Oh, well, thank you, Jeff. And just want to say, you heard from Laura, you sort of got a program objective. Obviously, Jeff went through and gave you some of our thinking around the policy considerations. But now we'll talk a little bit about the opportunity that we have with commercial platforms. And I think you're hearing a theme that's resonating this morning, the theme of data and visibility and transparency. And so what we really do is see this as an opportunity to take some of the open market micro purchase spend that's going on there and bringing it under better management. So what are those opportunities? One is the opportunity to be a smarter buyer through access to that spend data. Two, it's really to have some visibility and transparency into those buys of what are we actually introducing into the federal supply chain. And three, we want to give an easy experience to buy these COTS items to the government agencies through simple ordering procedures. So let me take a little time and talk about spend data. GSA anticipates through the spend data that we're going to gain new insights into spending, what's going on, particularly around transactions that aren't visible today. This is going to help us meet a variety of different important government purchasing objectives, particularly in areas of small business, socioeconomic considerations, Ability One. And so in the RFI, we outlined a number of variety of different data elements that GSA would be looking for e-marketplacers to provide back. GSA plans to house the data centrally, and we plan to make it available to the customer agencies. So what are some of the data elements that we're looking to obtain that should shed some light on agency spend? First is purchase data, things like ship date, delivery date, sell price, total price, agency name. Next is product data. We really want to have good data around what products we're actually buying, description data, information like country of origin. We're also looking at vendor data. What's their socioeconomic status, different things about that. And providing these data elements out for comment, we're really trying to seek a balance. In our market research, we saw that the different e-marketplaces have a variety of different capabilities. But we also need a common set of data so that we can actually aggregate the data across the program, but also assess the impact to existing programs through a proof of concept. In addition to standard data elements, we're also looking at the data analytic capabilities and dashboard capabilities. So we're looking to gain insights of, at the enterprise level, what's going on within an agency. So at the bureau levels and on down. We're looking for information on frequency of purchases by agency, cost saving, shift in delivery time of others. We want to make purchasing history and invoices available at the buyer level. And all of this should lead to a complete analysis of the spend below the micro purchase threshold. We're also looking for platforms to provide workflow, and this is really important, where agencies' approvals will be able to approve purchases at certain dollar thresholds and have access and visibility and transparency into what they spend. And we heard this loud and clearly that there's been some hesitant in terms of customer agencies out there wanting to authorize purchase card holders to go up to 10,000. We believe the workflow capabilities may solve some of those problems. We're also thinking about the catalog data and how do we get access to the catalog data. So GSA is looking at some of the capabilities of how we would do these things and surveil some of the e-marketplace so that we're ensuring that they are meeting some things like important supply chain risk management requirements. We'll be looking at things that are prohibited products up there. Is there potential supply chain risks and monitoring price fluctuations? One key area that we've heard a lot of feedback out is data rates. This has been a concern that's been reiterated in the legislation through our conversations with e-marketplace providers, suppliers, other important stakeholders. This is an area of particular importance that we've called out in our most recent RFI, and we're actively seeking all of your thoughts and inputs on this before the March report. In last year's National Defense Authorization Act for 2019, there was a section called 838. And it states, the e-marketplace provider shall not use government spend data for pricing, marketing, competitive, or other purposes. Any information, including any government-wide owned data, such as purchasing trends or spending habits related to the product from a third-party supplier featured on the platform, provided through this contract, or the transaction of such product, except as necessary to comply with the requirements of the contract. And so we're trying to take a very balanced perspective in terms of this statutory requirement. We've heard a number of different things from e-marketplaces. We've heard that this language is too restrictive, that some could interpret it as the ability for that e-marketplace to effectively manage the marketplace. It could limit things like the ability to perform quality control functions or oversee supplier performance. We've also heard that from e-marketplace providers that it's not in their business model to go in and it is in their best interest to have third-party suppliers that are successful on the web, on their e-marketplace. And that is an active part of their business model. We've also heard from concerns from suppliers. We've had concerns particularly about controlled access to the federal market. They're concerned that if they have to go through e-marketplaces to gain access to the federal market, that would limit their capabilities. I want to iterate that GSA is committed to continual competition and ensuring that suppliers have choice of e-marketplaces to choose to sell for if they want to participate through the program. We're also committed to make sure that they do have other channels to sell to the federal marketplace. Competitive advantage. We've heard concerns from suppliers that e-marketplace having access to their data would give them insights that could force them to gain a competitive advantage over those third-party sellers selling in the marketplace. GSA recognizes all of these concerns, and we are continuing to strike a balance being able to leverage the benefits of e-commerce, while at the same time making sure that we are setting up a channel that is attractive and effective for suppliers to sell through the government, and making sure that we're increasing competition both at the marketplace level as well as the supplier level. Now let's turn to a topic that we heard a little bit this morning about, federal supply chain risk. You heard Jeff talk about one of the key things that we're looking to do is make sure that we understand and manage risk. And this is how we're very much looking through the lens of this issue. Supply chain is an important consideration for our national security. It is an emerging challenge in federal acquisition, but it is also an emerging challenge in the commercial world we all purchase from today. And so we're seeing a lot of movement in federal acquisition. We'll continue to see the movement in terms of how to address supply chain across the government. In the development of the latest RFI, there were a number of factors that we believe reduces risk. And we're actively seeking your thought and impact before the March report. Here are a couple. One is the dollar value. The proof of concept is limited to orders below the micro purchase threshold. The legislation actually authorizes it up to the simplified acquisition threshold. Dollar values of transactions that Jeff's our thought is that it increases as the dollar value goes up. Two, we're actually looking to leverage commercial supply chain risk management practices that exist today. And you'll see that in the RFI. Jeff and Laura mentioned that we had over 75 one-on-one meetings. And through that, particularly with the e-marketplaces, we got the opportunity to get a deep dive of what type of supply chain risk management practices they already do. They do things like supplier vetting. They do worry about issues like counterfeit items. And so, in the vein of adopting commercial practices, we should already be leveraging these supply chain risk management practices that exist commercially. Three, applying the existing requirements. You'll see in the RFI that we're applying the existing supply chain requirements that apply to micro purchases. We're also anticipating that this is going to change in the federal marketplace. So we're also asking the really important questions of what the portal provider's capability are to manage these requirements over time as the government's requirements change over time. This is an emerging area in federal acquisition policy. And I think we all know that there will be new requirements for the government as those policy decisions are made. So we want to make sure that the e-marketplaces are positioned and capable to be able to meet those requirements as they evolve out and over time. 4, we are looking to limit the product categories at the agency level. GSA is starting with the e-marketplace's full catalog of items because it's appropriate to government-wide supply chain requirements. There are no limitations that exist for micro purchases today. We're being very deliberate in that decision. We want to maintain balanced incentives for both government and industry to fully utilize this channel versus the open market. However, we do recognize that e-marketplaces have the ability to limit certain categories. We also recognize that there's policy considerations at the agency level in respect to supply chain. So we're very much looking for the ability for the e-marketplaces to curate the catalog that would be available to certain agency buyers. Lastly, and one of the most important concepts that we have is the idea of transparency. We recognize that today our purchase card holders can go into the open market, they can go to a brick and mortar store, they can buy an item today. We have no visibility, no transparency into those items. We don't know, in some cases, what we're introducing into the federal supply chain. We see this as an enormous opportunity to bring some of that spend under management, to gain insight to what are the items that we're actually introducing into our supply chain. That will definitely let us better understand our risk and also take better actions to mitigate risk. The last topic I'd like to briefly touch upon that was included in our RFI practice was the draft ordering procedures. Our approach in coming up with the ordering procedures was to maximize the flexibility that was allowed for by law, and we had a couple goals. 1, easy. We wanted to make it easy for both our buyers and sellers. 2, compliance. We wanted to enhance compliance with mandatory sources such as Ability One. 3, competition. We want to make sure that we're driving competition both at the e-marketplace level and the suppliers levels. 4, small business. We want to make sure that we're encouraging the utilization of small business through this program. And lastly, we want to make sure that purchase decisions are driven by best value. We recognize that there's a multitude of factors that can drive a purchase decision. And we want to make sure that e-marketplaces have the capability to capture the basis for that purchase decision, but let buyers make a best value decision. Again, we see significant opportunity through the e-marketplace initiative to bring a lot of open market micro purchase spend under management. I look forward to your questions and continued opportunity. With this, I'm going to turn it back over to Laura for some closing remarks.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jeff. I think that throughout the course of all 4 of our comments, first of all, I hope that you understood that we've heard and incorporated the feedback that you shared with us. And so in that light and in that context, we had hoped what we wanted to do today was really walk you through all of not only the history, the facts, but also more of the context, the background, and what we're trying to accomplish with this. And I hope we've accomplished that. So with that, we have another RFI out on the street that lays out a path forward that we would like to ask you to comment on by December 21st. Which would give us time to incorporate it in the report that we have due to Congress in March. So, and as we go forward with that, we'll be using that also to inform the proof of concept, to be able to test out these procedures, this path forward, and get a sense and answer all of the questions and feedback that we've raised today. So with that, I think many of you in the audience might have a few questions for us, and so let me pass it over to Chris to get things going.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, everybody. Actually, I think you answered everything that everybody in the room might have, so I'll give everybody time back. No, I do appreciate the detailed and straightforward discussion that was just had, but I'm sure we will not lack for questions. We have some microphones set up, so please begin queuing shortly, but I'll begin with a few framing questions that I think might be on people's minds, and then we can go to the audience for further questions. The first thing I'd like to ask, and I'll direct this to Laura to start, and anybody else can feel free to supplement as needed, but want to combine, many of you were probably here for this morning as well, and we heard a lot about the consolidation efforts of the MASS program. So I want to ask how you see this commercial platforms effort aligning with that initiative, and broadly, can you speak to how this ties into the broader federal marketplace initiative?
Great. Thanks, Chris. So today's event, and I started out addressing this, was really focused on the entire GSA Federal Marketplace Initiative, which the vision is how do we improve the federal marketplace as a whole for the buyers and sellers. And so what you heard about this morning with the MASS reform is really, and the Modernizing the Schedules program, is to reflect the integrated nature of the market, where the commercial market's moved to, and how does GSA best support that. We view really this commercial platforms initiative in the same light, in the modernization of how simple COTS purchases are made, specifically those made on the open market, as you heard echoed from across the four of us today. We recognize that there's multiple channels available to buyers, and as part of the federal marketplace effort, we have the opportunity to really refine all of GSA's offerings to be able to meet the buyers and the sellers where they are. So really, we see both the MASS consolidation effort and the commercial platforms program as complementary to one another, and really focused on that same goal of improving the buying experience for the federal buyer and be able to focus contracting officers and the acquisition workforce back on their mission. So great.
Perfect. Let me target this one to Matthew and Jeff, if you can fill in as well a little bit. I think over the course of this, the discussion on how to best formulate this pilot, we've received questions about whether or not we're eliminating the need to comply with Buy American Act and Trade Agreement Act regulations. Can you address that topic?
Sure, maybe I'll go ahead and start. We have had a lot of conversations both in our public meetings and also in some of the sessions that industry associations, coalition, and others have sponsored. And just to maybe unpack it a little bit, I think the question isn't about whether the Buy American Act or Trade Agreement Act applies as a matter of law, at least to the proof of concept, because as we know, the law doesn't apply the BAA and the TAA to micro purchases. The question, I think, really is getting at GSA's decision made, the corporate decision, the business decision that GSA made a number of years ago for the schedule to make sure that all of the products on your program do comply with the Trade Agreements Act. And so the concern, I think, and you guys are here, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's premised on the assumption that the online marketplace is going to take work away from the schedules. And by the way, this, I think, is a great example of where the lack of data creates churn and anxiety, and in the absence of knowing affirmatively what's going on, fear can fill the void. And we don't know, but there are at least 2 or 3 specific indicators that would suggest to me, at least going into this, that we shouldn't assume that this program is going to immediately be taking work away from the schedules. One is what Jeff mentioned earlier. Some analyses show that schedule prices are in fact cheaper, that all of the work that GSA does up front in pre-qualifying contractors has an impact. And so once again, the rainbow is shining over my GSA colleagues, and we can have a moment of happy silence to celebrate the good value that schedules provide. So that's one. A second, and closely related and goes directly to what the discussion was this morning, are happy customers, right? I mean, rational behavior is that people that are happy stay with general approaches that work for them. And GSA isn't trying to improve the schedules program just because they have time on their hands and nothing better to do. They want the program to remain a viable and go-to program. It, I think, continues to be the largest single program we have in government for providing our buyers with access to the commercial marketplace. So the happier the customers are, you know, the more that they're going to stay with those customers, and if they're getting good prices, all the more reason. And I think, you know, also that at least anecdotally, but as best we can tell, after Congress raised the micro-purchase threshold, agencies didn't rush to just increase the authorizations on the purchase cards for all of their purchase card holders. There are a number of them that have expressed some reluctance to increase, and we think this is, you know, using good prudence, and the fact that, you know, GSA can offer, you know, information and insight for managers to see what's going on may make them more comfortable. Equally important in this, though, is for those people that are not using the schedules and are facing this risk, as they do today. You know, GSA has appropriately asked in its RFI the portal providers for information regarding their capabilities to provide country of origin data, and I believe that the ordering procedures also anticipate that this sort of information can be taken into account by our buyers in making decisions about what makes sense. And that, I think, is an appropriate step because, as you heard, you know, Mark and Jeff saying a few minutes ago with respect to supply chain, this isn't a passing fad. This is something that's only going to become more important and more central to the shape of our acquisition programs. And for those of you that have been following the dialogue, this administration has been working proactively with Congress on supply chain risk management legislation that would in part create a council to help rationalize lots of the activities that are going on and bringing the main players together: DHS, DOD, DOJ, OMB, NIST at Commerce, GSA, to have whole of government conversations that make sure people are carrying out their supply chain risk management responsibilities, many of which are already kind of been captured by FSMA, and equally important, making sure people understand their roles and responsibilities in doing supply chain. And one in particular is the role of GSA. When you think about Kaspersky and others, I think oftentimes people from our colleagues from Congress will run to GSA because as the government's buyer and then expect GSA to be taking actions on its own to solve the supply chain challenges when in fact those responsibilities still rest with individual agencies. Now GSA does have a role to play in working with agencies and in conveying information to ordering agencies, and that's precisely what I think you've heard Mark and Jeff talking about in terms of why data is so important, so that managers can understand what information is out there and make sense of it. And to the extent that there is country of origin information, that this can be taken into account into the calculus. And lastly, let me just point out that even though small dollar, you know, should help to manage risk, we already know through Kaspersky, you can have a $10 purchase and that can create significant risk in some circumstances. So again, this challenge, this risk already exists with the existing micro-purchase threshold. The online marketplace pilot isn't creating a new risk as we've discussed it today, but hopefully it will reduce risk by providing greater insight into our purchases.
Thanks, Matthew. I offered some comments a few moments ago that I think largely address our thoughts around some of the trade rules, but let me add a couple of additional considerations. We fully understand the argument and the value of trade agreements, the creation of American jobs, the whole series of really good and noble public policy that comes out of that. We have also, over the last year, been working on a couple of other high-level and important policy goals. One has to do with bringing new suppliers into the federal marketplace. There's a number of firms who, for a whole host of reasons, have not wanted to do business with federal government. They see risk, they see complexity, they see slow payment, they see a host of things. GSA drafted, and with OMB help, communicate to the Hill the importance of raising the micro purchase threshold and the SAT. One of the key benefits of that is the opportunity to bring the non-traditional, the new supplier, the emerging supplier, companies who have not wanted to do business with GSA. So as we're looking at a new program, and as we're looking at a discretionary opportunity to create those incentives to reduce a regulatory burden, we're at this moment feeling pretty reluctant to start adding in voluntary regulatory restrictions not required by law when we know that they cause impacts, some deliberate, some unintended. Our sense is let's test out, let's learn from this environment, and we can make course adjustments as we need to.
Great, thank you both. I have one final framing question, and if anybody wants to begin lining up for the audience questions, and we'll take them after this. But Mark, I'll start with you. We've heard a lot this afternoon about the importance of and excitement around transactional data. Can you talk a little bit about whether GSA plans, or how GSA plans to limit a portal provider's ability to use proprietary information or transactional data that's derived from third-party suppliers?
So, I mean, that's an issue we're actively seeking feedback within our RFI. So we're clear about, in terms of data rates, what I went through in my talk of what's in 83 of this year of FY19's National Defense Authorization Act. And with any ongoing contractual requirement, then we're going to have ability to surveil that. So that is one issue that we're looking at, that currently we're abiding by the law. There will be a contractual requirement. And then we're also looking at how would we monitor that requirement. We recognize that there's perspective both from the e-marketplace and the supplier community. Again, we're trying to balance those perspectives, but this is an area that we say, please do weigh in on the RFI in that particular area.
Great. Anybody from the audience that might have a question? Very shy group this morning, or this afternoon, excuse me. Okay, we have one gentleman in the back. And if you could identify your name and affiliation or organization, we'd appreciate it.
All right, I'll start off. My name is Burrow Williams. I'm with Integration Technologies Group. We're a government contractor. We've been in business for over 30 years. We've had a GSA schedule for over 20. I was on GSA Advantage the other day for a IRS requirement, and they were looking for specific items. And I went to Advantage and pulled up one of the items. And I know, because I've been in the business for 30 years, that it's not TAA, doesn't meet EPEAT and Energy Star, and doesn't meet the general contractual requirements. But on Advantage, I could see it provided by 15, 20 different vendors. And then I go look at each individual one, and there's different countries of origin, different descriptions. One company says made in USA, another one says Taiwan, another one says Korea. There's no consistency. If you can't keep GSA Advantage and the current contract holders on schedule correct and accurate, how is this marketplace going to manage more vendors, more openness with similar contractual terms that the agencies require without some type of governance and ensuring that it's right when GSA can't even do it themselves today?
Okay, there's probably two parts of that question that we should talk about separately. One is what do we do on Advantage today to try and oversee and enforce and ensure that the contracts indeed are representing accurate information? And two, how do we translate that into the portal environment? I'm going to partially defer to Mark on the first part, ask him to expand, but we have continually been trying to increase our suite of tools that check and look for some of the differences in data. A key to that has been product standardization, getting to common part numbers. Because when we're at a common part number and we have 10 companies tell us an item is made in Canada and one tells us it's made in India, or the opposite, that's some of the indications that we can use in better managing the program and in building some of the tools. I'd suggest that, again, in starting at the micro-purchase threshold, we deliberately are reducing the complexity, reducing the challenge of what applies by regulation. It's the opportunity to also start harvesting and running with the data. This only works because of today's technology. That's the only way that we can build the compliance systems, the edits, the controls. We've had a number of conversations with the e-commerce operators to understand what's possible to do from the account setup from the user standpoint. Part of that then starts taking us into some key roles within the agency, all around account management structures. We didn't talk a whole lot about the agency piece of this, but clearly there's going to be some significant agency responsibilities. Building on kind of the notion of the level 2 card coordinator of today, that there will need to be, if an agency is going to have specific requirements, they're going to need to start building that infrastructure to manage and oversee that. And well, I suggest that's part of the conversation that needs to continue with agencies to be meaningful.
Yeah, I'd like to just jump in here a little bit about what we do to manage trade agreements for the Schedules program. One, I want to remind that the way the policy works is a certification requirement. So the vendor community has the obligation for compliance. There's a number of things that GSA actually does to manage that risk. One thing we do in a pre-award is actually a tool that is called 4P that my office manages. It's become a widely adopted tool across our contracting officers, where it takes your proposed price offer information and runs various price analysis and supply chain risk assessments, including Trade Agreements Act. And that's prior to award. It flags some of the items that aren't TAA compliant and asks you to revise your offer based on various different inferences. Secondly, in a post-award sense, we use the same kind of data inferences and have a dashboard that's looking at that, and we're actually instituting some streamlined processes to take those items off of contract. Right now, we're piloting that with items that are not designated or improperly designated as made in America. In addition to that, we have the industrial operation community that goes out and does supplier visits, and one of the things they look at is your practices when it comes to Trade Agreements Act. Finally, and part of this federal marketplace is we're actively looking at how we're doing our catalog management. We have a key initiative that's looking at our catalog capability and how we improve that across the FAS enterprise.
Thank you both. Any additional questions from the audience?
I have a question.
Oh, sure.
Stephanie Collier, Federal Contracts Corp. We're in the heavy equipment arena. And so a lot of this initial stuff is not going to apply to us because not many of our purchases fall under the micro purchase threshold. But when this e-commerce reform option was announced, we started looking into it, and we have had some conversations with some of the okay, let's be honest. We talked to Amazon to see what Amazon does. And one of the concerns that we have is that some of these e-commerce platforms don't allow us to distinguish between selling to only federal government and the commercial marketplace. And for us, we don't sell commercially. Our agreements with the manufacturers that we deal with is that we will sell to the federal government. So for us, we would be limited at participating in something like this because we could not limit it to marketing only to the federal government. Is there a plan to address that?
So thank you for the question. The first thing I'll say is we have heard that concern from you and from others. Part of the legislation does call for commercial marketplaces that are actively out there looking at you being used by the private sector. So so the intent was always that these would be commercially available marketplaces already. The second piece of it is that by having multiple e-marketplaces available would be to allow for that type of negotiation and that type of discussion between the suppliers and the marketplaces to be able to find one that aligns best with the needs of your company to be able to put your catalog out there. So by offering that level of competition also among the suppliers about which marketplaces you sell through, hopefully some of that would be addressed. So That's also a point of feedback that we would like to receive in the RFI. As I said, we've heard some of that in other conversations as well. And we've been looking at sort of at what role does GSA play with that.
Let me ask you, Laura, do you have one? Perfect, great.
Hi, Tom Sisti, SAP. If you go back and look at the beginning of this process, when 846 was a standalone bill, you will recall that there was concern about it being too restrictive. And after a lot of deliberation, we came up with the language of 846, which talks about a broader look at solutions in the marketplace, talks about broader activities on the part of the administrator. The definition of e-commerce in the bill talks about solutions that are being considered. So then we fast forward to the implementation plan that was drafted in March. And we saw the presentation of 3 models. And at the time, industry had said, you know, we're concerned. We're concerned because when you take the spectrum of solutions and you say, okay, here are 3 models, you run the risk of focusing on one model, creating sort of a technological winner and a technological loser in the process, giving people a leg up, first to market status, all those concerns. The feedback was that you heard that thing, that's not what you're trying to do. Today, well, we saw the RFI, and of course there's a focus on one of the models, but today I'm hearing, and I guess I'm trying to validate if I'm hearing correctly, what I'm hearing is you're piloting one of the models, but that's not to say that the other models aren't going to be implemented, number one, and number two, that just because you're piloting this model doesn't mean it's going to be issued first, that it'll be assessed, and then there'll be some kind of context put to it, and consistent with the face of the statute, the language on the face of the statute, the spectrum of what you've laid out, marketplace, e-procurement, et cetera, will be issued out there as a competitive model. Am I correct in interpreting it that way?
Tom, at this point, we have evaluated several models. Our current line of thought is that we would begin with the e-marketplace model. That's not saying that will be the only model. As I said, we see a significant value at a later stage for the e-procurement piece. I don't think we have reached a conclusion on the portal piece. We've seen, we think, a substantial value in the e-marketplace. Our current line of thought is it makes sense to begin the first proof of concept there. But the whole idea is piloting and experimentation and learning from what we see in these. It's also intended to be a very collaborative dialogue, and if we have missed some key pieces, we need to know that. That's part of why we're having conversations of this sort.
Okay, just to clarify my question, because
Go ahead.
I understand what you're doing on the piloting. I'm talking about when you hit the point where you're going to issue a solicitation for contracts for these solutions. Are you saying that you're only focusing on what you have defined as the e-marketplace, thereby restricting what exists on the face of the statute, or are you going to solicit them all?
What we're saying is the one that we are contemplating soliciting for first is the e-marketplace. I'm not saying that we're not contemplating soliciting for the others. I'm saying that the one that we are thinking we would move first on is the marketplace.
Okay, and that's not consistent with the statute.
I don't agree with that.
Okay, well,
But
but
certainly
we,
have the dialogue and tell us your reasoning.
that's right. So that we should put in our responses to the RFI. Correct? Yes? No? Yes? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the concern, and there's concern across industry that the pilot approach, picking first, I actually heard about a different model today from a company outside the 3 that you've identified. So the concern is fundamentally that you're pre-selecting one approach that ultimately is going to define the market, period. And we haven't heard anything different from what you just said. That's a concern from the companies who have the e-procurement solution. That's a concern from the companies who have the e-marketplace solution. And you've done nothing here to alleviate that concern. So we will reflect it in our comments, but you're redefining the statute essentially by picking a winner up front, one particular type, when the statute's definition is much broader. Okay? That's the view, and it behoove GSA to explain how it's acting consistent with the statute. They're going down that path to implement the e-marketplace first. I think that's a fair observation, and I think it's a widely held concern across industry. Okay? And then I just need to follow up on a couple of things. I appreciate the comments, and it's a great meeting, but you've confirmed what we thought, that, and it's a circular argument, the process defines what's waived, not what is the merit of what's being waived or not being waived in terms of cost-benefit analysis. And the process is the micro-purchase threshold. Time and time again, the reference is the micro-purchase threshold doesn't apply these things. There's no discussion here about the merits of whether it's Trade Agreements Act or other provisions and whether those apply or should apply or not. And you can go back in the history of GSA, and you know this, it's not a business decision, and we had the NASA Soup versus GSA issue of applying the Trade Agreements Act, where NASA Soup used to apply it, much as the way you want to apply it in this program. And this is a program, it's not a set of micro-purchase buys. So NASA Soup used to apply it at the order level. GSA schedules, Jeff, as you know, applied it based on the value of the contract. There's a huge debate in the procurement community as what's appropriate and what's in the best interests of the federal government. NASA Soup now applies it at the contract level to be consistent. And I can tell you, when I was at GSA, I sat in meetings with the US Trade Rep when we were contemplating waiving TAA on non-availability determinations. And we were urged not to do that because of the trade implications of it and what the USTR was trying to do to promote fair access for American products across the globe. So here we're creating a program that could potentially be millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, where we're not even talking about whether it should be applied or not. We're just saying, because the micro-purchase threshold applies to a program that could account for millions and millions of dollars of purchases, therefore it doesn't apply. What we hope you do is in your report, you lay out the cost-benefit analysis from a trade perspective, from a US jobs perspective, that addresses the decision and the merits of waiving the TAA versus having it in the context of this. Because I don't think it's going to, in a large part, what people look at that and they've said to me is that the statute says GSA is supposed to can provide information to the marketplace providers for purposes of screening products or suppliers. It's clearly in the statute. TAA, cyber, excluded parties list, counterfeit, gray market, those are all things that, the way the statute's written, GSA could theoretically be responsible for assisting buyers in making decisions via the e-marketplace. But instead, what we're doing here is we're putting all those decisions onto the buyer. So I think you need to look at that too to see if it's actually going to make it easier for the buyer or if it's actually going to reduce risk, and what's GSA's appropriate role in that, because the statute clearly contemplates that. Thanks for your time.
Right, thank you for the comment. I think we have a question in the back.
Rob Burton, Kroll Mooring. I'm curious as to why it appears as if you are applying new rules to micro-purchase. I can understand GSA's desire to limit this initial phase to micro-purchase, but looking at the RFI that just came out, I think it's rather clear that you are planning to impose new contract clauses and new requirements to micro-purchases which have never existed before. And I think most people in industry would agree that it's always been good to have fewer rules applied to micro-purchase. And as you know, virtually no rules apply right now. I don't think I saw Congress encouraging new rules applying at the micro-purchase level. I'm curious as to whether you think Congress did give you the authority in this statute to actually apply new contract clauses and rules to micro-purchase. So if you guys could just elaborate a little bit on the idea of applying more rules to micro-purchase. And also, I think I saw 30-some clauses being applied to the e-commerce provider. Is the idea that I think you're trying to get them to enforce certain rules on the suppliers on their platforms? Curious to what role you see the provider taking with respect to enforcement or compliance of rules on their suppliers. I think that's an interesting point that I'd like to hear you elaborate on. My final concern, I guess it's more of a concern than a question, is to what extent would agencies, suppliers, e-procurement providers, what incentive do they have to go to this portal, considering that they'd be signing up for new rules and requirements, whereas they could just deal separately, as they are right now, without all of these new rules and requirements. If you could address the incentive for agencies and suppliers to use this portal. Thank you.
And I'd suggest first, our last two comments are a great example of the complexity and challenge of the issue that we're talking about. In terms of new rules, I think what we're really talking about is new procedures in micro-purchase, not new rules imposed on industry. What you'll actually see is, one, the establishment of the idea of competition at the micro-purchase threshold, where we are asking the buyer to look at more than one product. We're also recognizing that with workflow, with giving the agencies new tools to start managing that, there are likely to be questions, and so the buyer needs some means to document the basis for the decision. So beyond those two, Rob, I'd be interested in what you see as a new rule. I'd suggest we've been very conscious not to create new rules at the micro-purchase threshold. In terms of the clauses, we took an extensive dive through what is required by statute. And those largely come down to statutes that carry criminal penalties, statutes that get into funding law, or others that are expressly required. Wherever there was discretion as to whether or not to apply, we've had a lot of conversations looking at the policy issue, and does it make sense to apply something that maybe the FAR Council chose to apply to commercial item contracts, but that was not required to be done so by the statute. In general, we came down with the decision, if it was consistent with the commercial practice, we probably want to carry it forward. If it was not consistent with the commercial practice, we probably did not carry it forward. I think the last piece of your question was about what is the value in this for agencies. And I think we've kind of covered that fairly heavily. What we see as the number one value is data, getting the line of sight, the understanding on the spend, the ability to redirect spend into preferred agency direction. There's a secondary value in addressing some of the fear that's out there on the part of the buyers, on the P-card holders, and others who are so sensitive to the intense oversight in this environment that giving them an approved channel with a backing, with information, with support, we think offers a significant value in the marketplace.
I'd just like to add to in the value, I think there's a powerful thing about having economies of scale across government and having a program. So we know that there are other efforts going on right there, and so we can have further bifurcation across the government, or we can have a program that essentially managed and does achieve economies of scale in that management.
And I just want to, and I know Matthew has a comment to add as well. Going back to the value, I mentioned that we recently had a workshop with the agencies, and Jeff's description of the value is absolutely the reasons that they were interested in this, as well as going back to the whole of government approach. But the fear of using the purchase card is certainly out there, as well as the desire on the agencies for those who haven't moved to the $10,000 limit to be able to, one, have greater confidence in what their buyers are doing and insight into that. But then the other piece of it is then to be able to also take those low dollar buys off of the workforce. Jeff addressed many of the same things that came up in it covered all of the items that came up in that agency discussion when he walked through his value proposition earlier during his remarks.
You got everybody on the panel to react. That's why he's a good lawyer. So I would just add, I think everything that my colleague said makes sense. And just again, going back for a moment, it took a number of years for Congress to decide to raise the micro-purchase threshold. And while I don't want to open this Pandora's box today, the reaction from the community to the administration's proposal to raise the threshold to $25,000 for this program, I think what it signaled to us is that there's a pretty significant difference in the world of micro-purchase from even simplified procedures. And the world that we've created of 1994 is a little different for the purchase card holders today on the online, whether they're using the online marketplace or just going out on the internet on their own through any other tools that the agency provides. And as a policy matter, I think we do need to do a little thinking about what is the sweet spot of what's a smart use of technology to make smart buying decisions. Because if purchase card holders make dumb decisions, nobody wins, and the authority will be scrutinized and perhaps will move backwards. But I do appreciate Rob's point that the challenge also is to see this as an opportunity for where we can alleviate burden on our contracting officers. Somebody made the point the other day, which I think I've had in the back of my head for a number of years. If you go back to the 1990s and acquisition reform, one of the significant changes that was made, if you recall, we used to have 1105s. I think that was the job series. They were like procurement clerks that did a lot of the kind of the lower dollar clerical type procurement activities that needed to be conducted. And I think that it's a good kind of point to keep in the back of our minds, because if you look at the average portfolio of a contracting officer today versus in the early 90s or late 80s, I think you will see that they have a lot more on their plates. Now, it's not all just because of the loss of the 1105s, but I think that's part of it, and that's oftentimes what gets cited back to us, that if a contracting officer had 10 very complicated procurements, in the old days, now they have that, plus they have a whole plate of other activities that they have to attend to. And what does that do? That reduces their time to think about the complex procurement. So we do have to think carefully about, what we're imposing on folks. But I think there is a benefit, and I think Jeff stated it well, of making sure that there is some sort of appropriate guardrails in what we expect of our card holders to ensure that once this activity is transitioned to them, that people are confident, and all of us, as stewards of the taxpayer dollars, are doing smart things with the card.
Great, thank you all. Before we close on this portion, I do want to ask Laura to give a little bit of a sneak preview, reminder, highlight of what the upcoming timeline is. In particular, Laura, if you can maybe reiterate some of the points of opportunity for industry to be engaged. We have the report coming due to Congress in March, where Congress will have an opportunity to further clarify, and we can provide further inputs to them. So if you want to highlight sort of to the points that have been made today, the further opportunities for input and dialogue and discussion to make sure that we're shaping this appropriately, that would be great.
Thanks, Chris. All right, I think if nothing else, you should be walking out of here and realize that we want to hear from you, and we take that feedback very seriously. With that in mind, a couple of key dates. December 21st is when we're asking for the feedback on the RFI, and the reason for that, for the short timeline on that, is really to give us time to incorporate it into the report that is due of March of 2019. So we'll be, over the holidays and into early January, very much working through all of the feedback that you share with us, incorporating that into the March report. I realize March may sound like it's a long ways away, but in the world of having to get things signed off, it's not that far away. So we have to have everything wrapped up in the January timeframe in order to go through the appropriate review process between GSA and then pass it over to Matthew to herd it through OMB on our behalf to make sure that we have that mid-March delivery. And the Hill is waiting for that. We had an opportunity to speak with them recently about it. Meanwhile, at the same time that we're working on the report, that feedback that you're sharing with us is also going to be going into the draft solicitation that we mentioned to start the proof of concept. So as after the report's released in March, soon thereafter, you will see a draft solicitation to support the proof of concept, to get us to the multiple e-marketplaces that we talked about today, or some refinement thereof. And so we want to be able to have that proof of concept in place by the end of the calendar year 2019, so we can begin to get the agencies who are interested in engaging with us up and running as soon as possible, and begin to answer some of the questions that have been cited here today. So thank you very much again for joining us on this journey, and we're partway through and we still have a ways to go. So I hope that you will continue to join us.
Thank you, Laura, and if you wouldn't mind joining me in a round of applause for our panelists today. Before we close, I believe we have one final guest who should be here now, FAS Commissioner Alan Thomas. But before we hand it over to him, we'd like to thank everybody for being here. One more. Thanks Secretary Zinke of the Department of Interior for allowing us to use this beautiful space. And thank you all in particular for your participation and your questions and your further input and dialogue. So thank you, Alan.